Now we're recording. But the idea here is that as we're looking at the Song of Songs prophecies, what the rabbis are pointing out is that these prophecies, it's not like check off, fulfilled, check off, fulfilled. Instead, they see it as telescoping. It can go back and forth in terms of time, because time is really only relevant to us. Adonai is outside of time. So when these prophecies are spoken, we can say, well, when was it fulfilled? Yes, but you know what? There might be another fulfillment, and then another fulfillment, and then another fulfillment. And so we're getting some clues from the ancient rabbis as to what the footsteps of Messiah they thought it would look like based on their interpretation of scripture. And so we're going to go through that. But when I heard that little blurb, just scrolling through, I was looking for a documentary on something else. If you go on Netflix to where it lists documentaries, that's where I found it. And so just listening to the blurb, I said, this is important for right now, because if something has been done in a certain way before, there's a really good chance it's going to be done that way again. It may not be identical, but you might see an awful lot of similarity. Okay, so let me share my screen with you, and we'll jump right in. I'm not sure why I have that other PowerPoint up. Okay, so I'm labeling this one 49, and then next week's will be 50, and we'll just try to remember that little chunk of teachings went together in the Song of Songs. Otherwise, and it has to do with the parable of the fig tree. That's what we're pulling together, is the fig tree. So I'm not going to repeat last night's lesson. Just for the sake of time, I know there's a lot of material to cover today, so I'm just going to let that fall on you to go back and listen to the recording if you haven't already, because what we began with, could you please not groom each other? What we began with was the fig tree beginning to blossom. And then we looked at Revelation and how the unripe figs were going to fall in the darkness. That took us back to Egypt. But then as we followed the thread, it kicked us over into Babylon. And that's when we realized, oh my goodness, this thing is a telescope. It's going to take us back and forth in time. So we end up out in the wilderness. We've left Egypt. Now we're out in the wilderness. And we were looking at the context again, not just of the four horses, but of the unripe figs. That's what interested us, because the rabbis have interpreted unripe figs from ancient times as being unrepentant sinners. Right? So let's think of the Israelites. They've left Egypt. There's already been a pruning. In the 3 days of darkness, there's already been a pruning. Now that remnant has crossed over the Reed Sea. They're out in the wilderness, but we know from Torah that there's still a remnant within the remnant, that instead of going out and entering straight into the promised land, instead they entered into 40 years of testing. So in that wilderness, there was the potential there to continue in a state of a certain, they might perceive it as tribulation. But what some perceived as tribulation, others perceived as blessing. And that's kind of the thing to keep reminding ourselves when we're reading the news, or we're reading the latest thing that threatens our jobs or our Social Security checks or our retirement checks, or where we can go on those checks. We have to remember, ultimately, how I frame this is going to be what's more important than the reduction of income or the loss of income or the loss of freedom. that this is promising in the future, because in the wilderness, as they seem to hit these roadblocks, they can interpret it one of two ways. A small group of people said, yes, but we're about to have a great miracle. The greater number of people said, we've just hit a wall and Adonai didn't care about us anymore. He just let us out here to kill us. So keep that in the back of your mind, all the things that went on in the wilderness. And so Revelation 17:3 says, he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast full of blasphemous names and having 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, we're not going to try to decode the 7 heads and the 10 horns, but let's look at Israel in the wilderness. She's sitting on a scarlet beast. Definitely, there were Israelites in the wilderness who had not shed the Esau mentality, the Edom mentality of the red one. And remember, your soul that it represents, this scarlet soul, it represents your appetite, your emotions, and your desires, not just your intellect, but appetite, emotion, and desire. That's what comprises your soul, or the nefesh. And that soul is associated again with Esau, with the red one, with the red beast. And you can see through the centuries, like we keep looking at that image of the beast that Nebuchadnezzar built. And then, of course, we see the successive kingdoms of the beast. And what you have to realize that each of these kingdoms reigned based on the power of the soul, not of the Holy Spirit, but of the incredible power of the soul. When you were hungry, there's an incredible power in that. When you were angry, when you're expressing emotions or sadness or grief, there's incredible power in that. Your intellect, there's an incredible power in that, a creative power in that. And you can do great good and you can do great harm. It's when it's under the control of the spirit of Elohim that you're going to see it manifest in ways of great goodness. But when you're reduced to just letting the soul drag the spirit along behind, then what you see is that which should have been the head becomes the tail, and vice versa. And so these kingdoms are built upon appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. And so this woman is riding that beast. It's the implication here is the beast is taking her for a ride. And that's the problem. Addiction is a great illustration of how the beast works. There's something about that drug or that alcohol. What is it? Your own desire, right? Your own intellect. Some people get addicted to their own intellect. Pride is one of the manifestations of that. At any rate, it looks good. And so it lures you in based on what you want, not what you don't want. It lures you in. The bait is what you want. And in a really sick sense, that's what you get. You get exactly what you wanted, but there was way more to it than you were shown at first. And so if that drink of alcohol escalated into a drink every day, to multiple drinks in the day, till all of a sudden you don't think you can live without it, and you will go into withdrawals without the alcohol. You say, this is not what I signed up for. Well, exactly, that's riding the beast. You think you're riding the beast, but it is the beast taking you for a ride. And so this kind of describes a certain portion of Israel in the wilderness. They are still at the mercy of their appetites. They don't like the manna. They don't like heavenly food. They still want garlic and onions and melons and cucumbers and the good things of Egypt. And so it's this appetite. There's emotion. They're constantly complaining, gossiping, griping, carrying on. And intellect, because often the miracles will conflict with our intellect. will say, well, that's not rational, that's not logical, or that's not secure in my mind, because it's built on faith sometimes. And so there's constant clashes in the wilderness to a people being called, exercise your faith, exercise your faith. He's not asking them to step into thin air, because their faith should tell them, I brought you this far. You think I'll drop you here? It's going to feel like you've been dropped at times, but I will not drop you and leave you here. And I perceive that even in a lot of believers today, they somehow believe that they have had faith in Yeshua and they've tried to be, good people. And all of a sudden they're just dropped out here, in a mob of heathens. How did I get here? You have to see beyond and see, this is a test. He's bringing me to a wilderness. He's kicking away my support systems. He's kicking away all my good memories of what America used to be, or what South Africa used to be, or what Australia used to be, or what Great Britain used to be. He's taking away all my comfort thoughts. And now it feels like there's nothing to replace them but chaos. In a test, there is a stretch of time that is chaos. And that's when you hold on to the faith that's telling you, look, he brought me this far. Would he have saved me in Yeshua? Would he have filled me with his Holy Spirit? Would he have revealed his Torah to me and then dropped me? See, it's a bigger stretch of the imagination to believe that he would bring you this far and drop you. So I hope that helps you get into the mind of why there would be two women in the wilderness. There's going to be one woman who remains faithful to her testimony, and there's going to be one woman who will still be at the mercy of her desires and her intellect. And we know that generation dropped. And I don't know where their bones are, but apparently they were scattered around the wilderness. So as we continue into the next verse, it says, the woman was clothed with purple and scarlet and adorned with gold, precious stones and pearls, holding in her hand a gold cup full of abominations and of the unclean things of her sexual immorality. All right, so as Israel comes out of Egypt, they take with them, it says, request of your neighbors, all kinds of jewelry and precious things and clothing and so forth. And that's exactly what the Israelites did. They took the purple and the scarlet and the gold and the precious stones and the pearls and the gold cups. They took those out of Egypt. But what they also took, some of them, was a cup full of abominations. They did not leave idolatry behind. They might have repented in the 3 days of darkness, but they get out here in the wilderness where things are unknown, and the human tendency is to return to what is known, to return to first experiences. And this generation has been living in a nation of idolatry and sexual immorality, which is idolatry. And so what do they do under pressure when Moses disappears? They return to idolatry. They worship the golden calf. Not all of them, but some of them worship the golden calf. So they return to these unclean things that constitute spiritual adultery. And it also implies that they engaged in sexual immorality in the wilderness. So the Holy One has absolutely adorned her with every precious thing she could possibly have, taken her out into the wilderness, and she still wants to ride the beast. She can't wait for Moses. And the Midrash at this point suggests that there will come a time during the footsteps of Messiah, which is what I want to talk about today, is the footsteps of Messiah. There will come a time when the wicked will persecute the few remaining men of truth, forcing them to flee from civilization. And it's clarified, of course, that's in the English translation of the Hebrew, but the footnote to that clarifies what does it mean forcing them to flee from civilization. The footnote says it forces them to flee to the wilderness. And if you feel like you're under that pressure right now, that the wicked are persecuting you and forcing you to flee from the systems that you've lived very comfortably within all your life, then just kind of transfer this to what might be happening right now is I'm being pushed out into the wilderness by the wicked. And this is part of the holy plan. And so, yes, it's not going to be comfortable, but the reminder is, it's just like a dog. If you poke a stick at a dog, it'll try to bite the stick. And the dog never really considers what's in control of the stick. And so if he's going to lead you out into the wilderness to test you, he's going to do it by pulling away anything you have leaned upon more heavily than him. And you might begin to blame the government. You might begin to blame politics. You might begin to blame immoral people. You can blame all sorts of things. Conspiracies, go ahead. But in all your wondering about who's making you miserable, consider who holds the stick and who has to clear this table before he can reset it in the presence of your enemies. He's got to clear the old systems off the table completely. He's not going to build on top of something unclean and immoral. And that's what's the process has begun. He has begun, even though it looks like they're in charge right now, we know they're not. This is just a way, and you'll notice they'll turn on each other. And that's a pattern in scripture. He'll have an army turn on itself. This is what you see. At the moment you think you're in the greatest peril, you'll wake up the next morning and the whole army's gone. Keep that in mind as you feel yourself being pushed into the wilderness. Because the wilderness, it's more than a remote place. If we go out in the wilderness today that the Israelites wandered in, yes, it is pretty remote. It is pretty desolate. But you'll also realize it's crisscrossed by all kinds of ancient highways. So the wilderness, it wasn't completely cut off from other people. It simply wasn't a place that most people would want to live, unless they had a really good reason, like maybe a caravanserai, like a rest stop, modern day rest stop. But for the most part, except, they had Bedouin back then, just as today, unless there was a well, a water hole, there wasn't much chance that anybody was just going to set up shop there. The only people that would be able to set up shop out in the wilderness would be people who had an independent water source. Because you would have to move the sheep from well to well. Once they grazed what little forage there was down, then you would have to go to the next well and feed the sheep there. They eat that, you go to the next well. That's how the Bedouin work. And so if the Israelites had not had their independent water source and their independent food source, it would have been a little bit different experience. But in this case, they could go wherever the Spirit led them. What it did not have is the comforts and the conveniences of Egypt. And they bring that up. They miss this, and we miss this. We could just move a little floodgate with our feet, these little locks that would irrigate the fields, and water would come in. But see, out here, it's not like that. So it's not that they didn't have water. It's not that they didn't have food. It's just they didn't have the convenience and they didn't have the comfort. But the greatest gift to the Israelites was the Torah, and it was given to them in the wilderness. So when the woman is taken into the wilderness, she's going to encounter the Torah. See, why are all these things happening? He is forcing us to encounter his word, because if we have been casual with his word up to this point, there will come a point where we have to decide, because there is no casual Torah past that point. You're either 100% in or you're 100% out. And you might even end up turning on people of faith. Once you realize you're not willing to endure the discomfort that is required of being in that wilderness and accepting that Torah and the birth pangs of forming a nation, which I think we're in right now. I think we're in part of those birth pangs because, as you come to birth, that's the most uncomfortable time of all. Things are getting moved around. You're getting moved around. You're getting in position to enjoy literally a new birth of freedom. And so Deuteronomy 8:2 reminds us what the purpose of the wilderness was. You shall remember, he says, don't forget this, because if you forget it, then it won't be with you at a critical time. And I think we're in a critical time right now. Remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years. This is why we study the Torah portions. So we won't forget one step they took, one test they went through, because we can expect we will have some form of that test ourselves. So he says, remember that. In order to humble you, putting you to the test, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So remember, in Egypt, we had a pre-decision. It's a decision, but it was an early decision before they received the entire Torah. And basically, the blood on the doorpost, the circumcision, it says, whatever comes next, we're up for that. But see, when that came, the Torah was part of living in the wilderness, then they had a hard time relinquishing their pride. And you say, well, how could slaves be proud? You know what? The poorest person in the world can be proud, can refuse to be humbled according to the word. It's not how much pocket money you have. It's a lot. The pocket there is a lot deeper. He says, I have to know what's in your heart. How can I take you into the land until I know that you're going to keep the commandments? Because the land is a place where you must keep the commandments. If you can't, it'll spit you right back out. And we've seen that in history. And then he repeats it again in Deuteronomy 8:16. He just rephrases it. He says, in the wilderness, it was he who fed you manna, which your fathers did not know, in order to humble you and in order to put you to the test, to do good for you in the end. Right? So that's what we have to remember as we're disconnecting from things we've always relied upon, things that we thought were trustworthy. As we pull away from those things and we enter into that state of uncertainty and saying, where will my next meal come from? Where will my next gallon of water come from? Where is my next destination? As we go through those tests that are designed to humble us, because see, as long as we're leaning on Babylon, we're not humble. We're taking pride in human accomplishment. But he says, I want you to take pride in my accomplishments. If you're gonna be proud of anything, be proud of me, but humble yourself. So as we're reading what the rabbis say about this generation that is going to experience the footsteps of the Messiah, that they will go into a wilderness. The idea here, I think, that they're trying to help us understand is that this is going to be a people who separate from other systems, but yet they're hugging the Torah more closely. And even as the tests get heavier and heavier, they cling tighter and tighter to the Torah. They're going to move away from the world's support systems, because those support systems are there to also control you. If they support you, they control you. If you rely upon them, in a sense, they own you. You're still a slave to the system. So as you move away from believing in the world's support systems, and in turn, you start to rely upon the Father for your daily bread, remind yourself of the three temptations that Yeshua experienced also in the wilderness. He was tempted in respect to bread. He was tempted in respect to pride and what was happening. The adversary tried to twist the words, just jump off of here and an angel will catch you. Isn't that what the word said? Well, if we've always taken pride in our own interpretations and applications and instigations of the word, that it's actually our faith itself that has become leavened, then he will take away your religious pride. I call it word wrestling. And it's just like the snake did. What did he do? He enticed Eve into a debate over the word. And it wasn't an honest debate. She was lured in to a word wrestling match because the snake had pride. And of course, he lost his legs over that. But in the end, that's what happens. You get cut down to size. So you can do all the word wrestling now you want and trying to outdo somebody else with your words. But in the end, that's not wilderness survival. That's a pretty good way to get left in the wilderness. Yeshua humbled himself and said, as much fun as it would be to take a big leap and see if an angel would catch me, not going to do it. I'm not going to twist the word. I'm not going to wrestle with it to force Elohim into my particular application of it. Same thing with the bread. He humbled himself. And then the control issue, bow down to me, you can control all these kingdoms. So those are three main things. As you get out here farther into the wilderness and you say, okay, I'm going to cling to the word, I'm going to cling to Yeshua out here in the wilderness, you have to expect that it's going to get more uncomfortable before it gets better. He will test you relative to your income. He will test you relative to any religious pride that exists. If we've been taking pride in his word and just trying to outdo the next person with our discovery of the word or put down someone else's, he'll deal with that in the wilderness. If you have control issues, if you want to be respected and admired, and I think this is where Yeshua says, don't let any man call you rabbi. I don't think he means literally. We've talked about that before. Call no man father. He can't mean that literally because that's going on all the time in scripture. What he's saying is, look, don't use your position, whatever it is, to control other people and to get them to serve your little idea of what the kingdom is. You have to relinquish control to the Holy One. And Yeshua passed all these tests with flying colors, always quoting the word back. But if you take these three things together and you look at them as there's really one test, then you can see what the generation of the wilderness had to learn before they could go into the land. What they had to learn was when to refuse a God competition. Because that's always the temptation. We want to be like God from the beginning. It's not that we wanted to live our lives according to his image and according to his likeness. We actually wanted to replace his will in our lives. We wanted to be God. We wanted to be the creators. We didn't want to just rule under his authority. We wanted our authority to be lifted at least equal with his. And he says, no, I don't share my throne with anybody else. So if there's any area of your life where you're sharing his throne, he's going to take you down a notch. And it's not going to feel good, but it's better to get pushed off your throne and to get on your knees in the wilderness than to get left dead in the wilderness. And here's what it says about Mystery Babylon, Revelation 18:24. It says, in her was found the blood of prophets and of the saints and of all who have been slaughtered on the earth. So he's talking about who's behind all the death in the earth, especially the death of the righteous. Babylon, this mystery Babylon, she's being identified as the catalyst behind all the blood that has been shed in the earth, especially of the prophets and saints who have maintained the testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God from the beginning. like Abel. And so Babylon is a city. In Hebrew, city is ear. Like you could pronounce it like your ears on your head with a little more throat at the end of it, ear. And if we look at what the first Babylon was, well, probably not the very first, because I think the first Babylon popped up in the garden. But if we look at our history of Babylon, the Tower of Babel, and we see what happened, it's thought here that Nimrod was the one instigating this, that he was trying to coalesce people into building this tower that would reach up into the heavens. And of course, in the judgment, they're scattered out, they're divided up into different nations, peoples, tribes, tongues, and so forth, because their tongues are confused. The idea here is, if we take our past lessons about, well, how far would the third heaven have been that they were trying to reach? Not far. They didn't have to build that tower very high. What they're talking about is touching a realm, basically passing back into the Garden of Eden by making themselves Elohim, making their creative ability on the same level as Elohim, to supplant his authority. He says, this is the way you get in. And they said, no, this is the way that you get in, that we can take it by force. So we want to go back and we want to look at the origins of what a city is. Other than Jerusalem, what is the history of cities on this earth? So let's go back to the shoresh. Let's go back to the root of what a city is. Ir, which is going to be Strong's 5782. It's pronounced Ur, not the same word like Ur of the Chaldees. It's a sound alike, and there's a lesson to be found there. But this Ur is going to help us kind of decode what happened in not just the garden, but even after the fallout of the garden, what happened between Cain and Abel. Because in a sense, Adam and Eve were killed in the garden. The snake killed them because he caused them to sabotage themselves in such a way that they fell out of the garden into mortality. So there's the first murders, or I don't know if we would say that a conspiracy to commit murder, but this first literal murder on earth, of course, is going to be the murder of a brother. You have Cain slaying Abel. You have the wicked, this spirit of mystery Babylon slaying the first saint or righteous one, the first one who brings the proper sacrifice. But once we understand what Babylon is, in terms of riding the scarlet beast, that she's going to be subject to her appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect, that takes you right back to the garden and what Adam and Eve saw. They saw that the fruit was desirable to touch, that it was desirable to taste. What's being alerted right here, what's being aroused right here by the fruit? The soul, appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. And the snake is promising you can elevate yourself. Now, here's the thing, they're already in the third heaven. They're already in the Garden of Eden, but we know that there's other heavens above it. The Garden of Eden is actually referred to as the lower garden, because it's thought that this upper garden, where the rivers originated from, that it actually flowed down into the lower garden, which was a mirror of this upper garden. And how many levels are above that, we don't know. Like it says, eye has not seen, ear has not heard everything. But what's happening with the Tower of Babel, let's elevate ourselves. And he says, you know what? If they get on board to do this, there really isn't anything that they can't do. The creative ability of the human mind, if we only knew what we haven't tapped into. It sounds like these guys were able to tap into that to a large extent. So he says, let's confuse their language. Rabbi Krieger sent me a video a couple of days ago of how they have started putting human embryo stem cells into monkeys. Human stem cells into monkey embryos. And the scientists are saying, we don't even know what it is. We don't know what kind of creature, we don't know what a being this would be if we allowed it to be grown all the way to birth. They're killing them after so many days. But you can see how far the human mind can take things, trying to be the creator, elevating themselves. And so this was what Cain and Abel, they have a commandment. They're supposed to bring the best. Cain, it says, brings of the fruit of the ground. Abel brings the choicest of his flocks. Well, in the same way that we see the serpent is jealous of Adam, trying to cut him down, trying to cut Eve down to the level of immortality so that he, the beast, can rule over the man instead of the man ruling over the beast, according to the commandment. You can see the same interaction with Cain and Abel. The one who kept the best for himself, who allowed himself to be drawn into a sacrifice competition, into a religious competition, so to speak. In his jealousy, he slays his brother Abel. Did he really think this would elevate him? No, it doesn't. It doesn't elevate us when we think we've won a religious competition or when we have to murder someone's character in order to win some competition that exists only in our minds. So let's look at the meaning of what a city is. If we look at the Strong's, look at how much of this has to do with the self. To be jealous, to hate, to take revenge. That's kind of crossing over into the Aramaic and Arabic branches of the tree. If we get back into the literal meaning, it means to rouse yourself, to wake yourself up, to incite yourself to do something, to be excited about something, to be triumphant, in other words, to win something, to stir up, to open your eyes to something, to wake up. But at the root of it, you see, it's the idea of I'm stirring myself. It's not really a response to an outside force. You know, where Abraham's told, Kum, arise, Abraham. He is told by the Holy One, you arise. In this case, there's simply getting yourself up, stirring yourself. It's an elevation of the self. And this is the root of a city. It's to elevate yourself, to be the master, to raise up, to be woke, to wake yourself. That should sound very familiar to us. Genesis chapter 3, verse 4 says, the serpent said to the woman, you certainly will not die. For God knows that on the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will become like God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. You see, it's hitting every point of the soul. The red one, the beast. She took some of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened. See, that's what addiction does. It's only after it's got you hooked. It's only after you've taken the bait. It's only when the net closes around you that you realize it for what it was. Then the eyes of both of them were opened and they knew that they were naked. They had sinned. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves waist coverings. All right, so here a fig leaf that we were working with in our verse from Song of Songs last night, the fig leaves pop up. And remember, the interpretation is an unripe fig. It falls like a fig leaf. We compared Isaiah to Revelation. And the unripe or the unformed fig, the fig that has never fully matured, it'll shrivel up, it'll die, it'll get knocked off by the first wind that goes through. And so it'll just fall off, like a leaf withers up and gets blown off by the wind. And so what they're using here is possibly the earliest use of the fig as a metaphor, because the fig can be a good thing as part of the 7 species of first fruits, or an unformed, an immature, unripe fig. And these usually come with that second crop, by the way. It's the same thing. It's an Israelite who had a destiny as an Israelite. There was a plan there, and they failed to embrace the plan. They turned loose too soon of the tree. So we've got a fruit here. It's not just appealing to their appetite or their taste. It's not just a simple hunger issue. It's not just a simple deliciousness issue. There's a deeper hunger in here. They want knowledge. They want beauty. They want aesthetics. They want creativity. They want all the things that attract people to a large city. Competition, jealousy, that's really what drives the culture and the creativity of a large city in every generation. If you want to hear the best music, you go to a city. If you want to eat the finest of foods, you go to a big city. If you want to find a wealth of human logic and knowledge, the great libraries, you go to a city. If you want to go to the great cathedrals, you go to a city. If you want to find art, you go to a city. But here's the thing with the city. What is driving that? It's not just the attraction of like-minded people who can generate all this good stuff. On the surface, that's what it is. But it can also be a trap. If you don't guard your heart, it can be a trap. And you will fall right into that spirit of competition, jealousy, and self-elevation that the root of a city means. Because as these cities grow, just like Sodom and Gomorrah, all this wonderful human creativity, instead of aiming it in a direction that promotes life and goodness, they will instead begin to try to elevate above Elohim. And it's all driven by commercial activity. And so you can see why the commercial activity is part of this mystery Babylon. It's a part of humankind constantly trying to elevate itself above Elohim, at least to make itself equal, but the striving is always there to actually lift. What is the king of Babylon? You have said in your heart, I will lift my throne above the Mount of the Moedim, or the Mount of the Moed. That's always the thing with Babylon. Eventually, you want to lift your throne above that which we know is good, that comes from Adonai himself. And a city is in a continuous state of stimulation and arousal of every kind. It's the opposite of what happens in the wilderness. If you've been out in the wilderness, if you've been out in the desert, you know that it's just the opposite. Not that much movement, not that much sound. But it's a place where you can examine your heart and be humbled. There was a reason that Yeshua at times went into the wilderness, because he needed that. He would go into the cities, and then sometimes he would not. He said, no, I'm not going up to Jerusalem right now. He went later, but not right now. There was something in him that said, you know what? There's a force in that city, and I need to make sure I'm strong when I walk into it. Now, Cain, even though he was cursed to never settle in a city, he was the first to build a city. The implication, the rabbis say, is that Cain really did go through and he would build cities, but he could never finish them. That was part of his curse. He sought the refuge, he sought the comforts of a city, and he would build it, and then he would be forced to move on. And even looking at his name, it means acquisition, to possess something, or to provoke jealousy. There's that competition was always in him. The idea of what a city means spiritually is that anything outside of Jerusalem, the potential is there for, and in the physical Jerusalem, that's happened too, by the way. But the only ideal city is Jerusalem above. That's the only ideal city. Every other city is suspect, and you would truly have to guard your heart to live there. And you say, well, does that mean country people don't sin too? And that's not what we're saying. We're saying the city can teach you a lesson about not riding the beast. So if this city of Mystery Babylon goes into the wilderness, then it sounds as though she could be somehow linked to the righteous who are going to be driven into the wilderness. Or the implication I was reading in the sources is that it's the wicked who are actually going to try to pursue, just like Pharaoh tried to pursue Israel into the wilderness, that the wicked, they may not be that aware of the absence of the righteous, but they will be aware. They may not miss the fact that their righteous influence was a kind of a staying force within civilization. And the fact that those righteous people would exit, they would withdraw, that might be comforting to them, but they're never going to be completely comforted until they wipe out those voices. And so it's very likely, just like Revelation is telling us, that when Mystery Babylon goes into the wilderness, it's to seek the life of the virtuous woman and her offspring. Because remember, they keep the testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God. They want to cut off those two things even in the wilderness so they don't come back. And it has been this city mentality from the beginning that murdered the righteous. If you go back to Cain, our first city builder, what does he do? He murders the righteous. The idea being, if they can remove the testimony of the word, then there's absolutely nothing they can imagine to do that would be denied to them. To them, there would be no realm of heaven that they couldn't rule, at least to their confused minds and to their confused tongues. That's the problem with being deceived. You don't know you're deceived. So to them, the greatest thing in the world would be to remove everybody, every shred of the testimony of Yeshua, every shred, every page of the commandments of Adonai, destroy every testimony of the word. And once you remove that, then they can replace it with their own human Bible, their own set of ethics, their own system of social justice, which, by the way, we already know at this point, it changes every day. It's not like the word, which is from eternity and going to eternity. It is fixed. It doesn't change. Our Father does not change. Well, social justice, governments, politics, ethics, these things change every single day. And if you don't know that's true, then you don't have an internet. But if they can wipe out this testimony, then there is nothing that they desire to do. There is no wickedness, no abomination, no sexual immorality that could be imagined that they would not be permitted or permit themselves, legislate themselves into doing. And I kind of wonder, this was just one of those thoughts that hit me. We've got this modern term woke, and it's actually a little older than my awareness. Apparently it popped up back in the 70s sometime, maybe even sooner. It's just now kind of coming into my consciousness as a term. But there is a segment of this generation who describe themselves as woke, that they have waked themselves up to the truth, which does tend to change every day in their world. But I wonder, is this a message from way back? From the first chapters of the Bible to us? Be careful. Being woke is having that ur mentality of awaking myself, elevating myself above the commandments of God. Is he giving us a shout out? Is he saying, don't you hear this as a footstep? Can you not hear this? Because the scripture tells us you're only truly woke if you stir yourself to obey his word. That's the only truly woke person. It's a resurrection spirit. There's resurrection power in the word. Any other kind of woke is not woke. It's just self-elevation. These are the ones who can die in 3 days of darkness. They can die in the wilderness. But see, this confusion of Mystery Babylon, it wants to dominate and it wants to eliminate the holy city, Jerusalem. And in the time of the footsteps of Messiah, apparently, even if the righteous were to withdraw from their systems, they would be pursued into the wilderness. Like Pharaoh, he wasn't content to just let the Israelites go. He wanted to follow after them and destroy them. But we know in the end, remember he says, I'm taking you out here in the wilderness so I can do good to you in the end. If I can humble you in the wilderness, it will be good for you in the end, because you'll find out what truly woke is. It's to be resurrected to Jerusalem of gold. That's the true city. That's the resurrection city. I can restore you to the land of Havilah in the Garden of Eden. And remember, it says, this is where there's good gold. This is where the righteous live. Isaiah, that it's what the second section of Creation Gospel Workbook 1, you work with that passage where the king of Babylon, his desire has always been the beast, the first beast kingdom. The desire of the beast kingdoms has always been to elevate their throne above the Mount of the Moed, which is Jerusalem. So Acts 2, verse 3, Babel, of course, is the confusion of tongues. But we know through Yeshua, eventually we will be of one speech. We will be of one accord. Not like the Tower of Babel, with the purpose of elevating ourselves, being woke ourselves, instead with the purpose of allowing his spirit to elevate us, and being content that wherever he places us, wherever he puts us, if it's his will, it's good with us. And in Acts chapter 2, verse 3, it says, the tongues looked like fire, appeared to them, distributing themselves, and a tongue rested on each one of them. Right? In the wilderness, they received the Torah. And if you'll remember in the Midrash, it says that these commandments were offered to the 70 nations of the world. And there was not enough. There was a remnant in each nation, but there was not enough in those nations for them to merit receiving the Torah. They would not guard it. They would not keep it. Only one nation said, we will do and we will hear. That was Israel. And so those from among those nations are being gathered into that nation that says, we will do and we will hear. How are they going to hear the word, though? In Acts chapter 2, we saw that representatives of the righteous from those nations had come in. The disciples start speaking, proclaiming the Torah, proclaiming the resurrection testimony of Yeshua that is in that Torah, and they take that message back to the nations with the idea that ultimately we will be gathered. And so what does Yeshua tell the disciples in Luke 24:49? He says, behold, I'm sending the promise of my Father upon you, but you are to stay in the city, not any city, not New York, not Prague. Stay in the city, Jerusalem, until you are clothed with power from on high. Now, power is the fifth spirit of Elohim. It's a resurrection spirit, just like the third spirit is a spirit of resurrection. It's the third spirit and the fifth spirits, they come from the same place on the menorah. They share the same head, quote unquote, head. So they're both resurrection spirits. We have the resurrection of Yeshua on the third day. We have the resurrection of the greater body of Messiah on the fifth day, the Feast of Trumpets. He says, stay there. Stay there until the resurrection. And you say, how can I stay in the holy city when I'm being chased into the wilderness? How can I stay in the holy city when I'm in exile? How do I do that? How do I maintain that testimony? How do I retain that fire of the Torah? Well, here's the great thing. If Israel did it, you can do it. They went to the wilderness. You can stay in that city until the resurrection. If, when you were in the wilderness, if you were in your exile, if you will obey the Father's instructions until the resurrection, then he will clothe you with power from on high. And so what Babel sent out into the earth in confusion, you will be part of the gathering process, and you will be returning with the righteous to that Ir HaElohim, the city of God. No matter where you are right now, if you're in a city, if you're in the country, if you're in the wilderness, as you withdraw from dependence upon those world systems and their wickedness, if you will maintain your testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God, if you will humble yourself, then you will remain in that city until the resurrection. Which brings us to the footsteps of Messiah, which I was hoping to get to 30 minutes ago. What shall we do? Let's just talk briefly about this other woman. And if you have to jump off, I understand. But I do want to get this in place, because if you're at this point, you're thinking, oh my goodness, things are going to get way worse, and highly likely. But we're supposed to encourage one another with these words. So let's look at this other woman who goes to the wilderness, and she has different characteristics. She's not allied. She's not Mystery Babylon, completely dependent upon the commercial, military, medical, religious, every system you can conceive. She is not dependent upon those things of the world. Her dependence is upon the one who flies her out to her place. It says, then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. And that 1,260 days, as we get into more of this, maybe next week, that might make more sense, because the rabbis will say the first 3.5 years of these footsteps are going to be terrible. But they say at the midpoint, for the righteous, they will actually begin to see the recreation. What the wicked are experiencing is something else. They're experiencing great tribulation, is what the message to Thyatira is. But for those who have repented at that point, it seems like they began to see daylight out of the darkness. So the Midrash refers to Isaiah 59:15. And it connects us, I believe, to why this woman would flee into the wilderness. 59:15 is referring to a time of the footsteps of Messiah, or the birth pangs of Messiah. And it says, truth became absent. In Hebrew, that's ne ederet. And refraining from evil seemed foolish. All right, look around. How hard is it to find truth anymore? The voice of truth is getting more and more faint. And it says, refraining from evil seem foolish. Any evil thing you can conceive to do, it's as if they're trying to legislate it into, if not permissibility, then compelling people to accept evil. And so the rabbis asked, it says, if the truth is to be absent among this pre-messianic generation, then to where will it go? They say it will go and dwell in flocks, adarim, in the wilderness. Okay, so what are they talking about here? If this is the generation of the footsteps of Messiah, how are they going to go into a wilderness? Their answer is they're going to go in flocks. They're going to begin to group up, is what they're saying. It doesn't mean that it's going to be one big mass of people who go into the wilderness. They say, no, it's gradually they will begin to group up into like kind and like mind. And the Midrash goes on to kind of clarify what Isaiah prophesied. They say the truth will not be completely absent, or else it would have said truth is absent. Instead, it implies a gradual disappearance of truth from society. Their expectation is that the older, righteous scholars of that generation will die. And those left will grieve and become anxious because so many troubles will come upon the righteous communities. The righteous will become so repulsed by the corruption of their generation that they will band together in groups and leave society to live in the wilderness, where truth will continue to exist in a limited way. They're kind of echoing that earlier comment. Gradually, the righteous will become just so disgusted. Kind of like it says Lot became disgusted with or vexed with the vile conversation in Sodom. But it took angels to pry him out. They say the righteous will be so repulsed that they will begin to withdraw. They will withdraw in such a way that they try to find like kind and like mind. And that's where they will live. In other words, that's where they will find life. It's by forming these communities and saying, wait a minute, I'm not alone out here. And so in that way, truth still exists, but it has less and less influence upon the world at large. Because remember, like we say, it may actually come to the place where the wicked want to pursue them wherever they go to try to find relief from the wickedness. So they say, and I'm trying to give you direct quotes here as much as possible. They say, even in this state of wilderness separation, harsh decrees will be constantly renewed and sent against Israel. Perhaps, this is my comment, explaining Babylon's presence in the wilderness. No matter where you go with goodness and truth and obedience, the wicked of the world will try to pursue you so that it is impossible for you to practice truth and obedience. They will find you in your wilderness. And so they will have successive harsh decrees to try to squash that. And when we look at the legislation that's been passed in the United States alone in the last 10 years or so, you can see it. It's harder and harder to live as a person of righteousness. And they say, while the first trouble is still extant, another one comes and joins with it. Before you can even recover from the last thing they tried to do to you, they'll add another one. They say young people will shame the old, and old will rise before the young. I've noticed that on commercials, how now the stereotype that's becoming more and more pervasive is that in a commercial, the child in the family will be the wise one, and the grown-ups will be the dummies and the foolish and the stupid. And it's the young people instructing the older how they should act. There is nothing a person of our age can do that won't be wrong tomorrow, according to these younger. I know they've got different names like Gen X and millennials and all that. I don't even care about that. It's the fact that they constantly try to correct us. If it needs to be corrected, yes, but it goes way beyond those sorts of things. It says a son will not be ashamed to commit sins in the presence of his father. According to Micah 7:6, they say that the role of parents will be diminished. We see this. The footnote says that social conventions will become inverted to the point that old people who should be respected will themselves subscribe to the new order and give reverence to youth. And I can't tell you how many times, probably over the last 20 years, maybe more, I keep forgetting how old I'm getting, I have heard people my age tell young people, well, don't call me Mrs. or ma'am, you'll make me feel old. Wrong. Wrong. The Torah commands young people to rise in the presence of the aged, that they are to respect the wisdom of the aged, and everything has been reversed. And the old people, just like this is, even the old people who should be welcoming this stage of their lives, because it's a time of respect that can't be earned by what you do. It's simply earned by virtue of the age you've attained. And they don't want to feel old. You're right. Being young really is the best thing. So this will probably have to be our stopping place just because of time. But I want to go back to the part I skipped. And it has to do with what the rabbis are saying, that when Israel goes into the wilderness, that the harsh decrees will just keep rolling out against them. Wicked decrees will just keep rolling out, making it harder to be a person of righteousness. This is why I wanted to let you hear, if you can. I don't know if I recorded it loud enough. If not, I put in the chat box how you can find it. And it's here on the slide for anybody that couldn't see the chat box. This is on Netflix, if you have Netflix. And the title of the documentary is called The Last Days. It's a Holocaust documentary. It's called The Last Days. I don't know if you can get it on another platform. It's possible you could. That's where I happened to see it. And so in light of what the rabbis are saying, life will be like in this wilderness time where we withdraw more and more from the world and the decrees of the world become more and more oppressive. I'll try to finish up here. If I can get this to play loud enough, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. So hopefully you can hear what's on here.
People wonder, how is it that we didn't do something? We didn't run away, we didn't hide. Well, things didn't happen at once. Things happened very slowly. So each time a new law came out or a restriction, we said, well, just another thing. It'll blow over.
Hitler moved into Hungary on 19th of March, 1944. I was 16 years old.
1944, March 19th. Germans entered, the SS entered our town.
2 motorcycles was the whole Nazi regime that occupied our town. Because they were already there with the people that lived there the whole time and did their dirty work. Most of them were people that we thought were our friends all these years, but they turned overnight on us and went with the other side.
And the next restriction was that the Jew cannot walk out on the street without a yellow star. We heard that in Germany they had to wear the yellow star before they were taken away, and in Poland they did that. So at that point we were worried.
Okay, so I know that was a poor recording and Uzi was snoring the whole time. But I wanted you to hear the perception of the people who went through the Holocaust and how they said it was so gradual. It would just be this thing was passed and then this thing was passed and we said, oh, it'll blow over. And it didn't. And so, like I said, with prophecy, there's telescope patterns here. And a lot of times something that has gone before, you might see something very similar to that again, something along that pattern. And so if our governments, I know, especially in this Tuesday class, we're all over the world, we're on different continents. But we look at what our governments are doing in terms of passing legislation. And it's making it harder and harder and harder to live according to our convictions as people of faith. I think I told you about this a couple of years ago. I was driving through downtown Lexington. There were all these people dressed up in white, demonstrating in the middle of downtown Lexington with these big signs against circumcision. Just blatant. Just blatant. And I took a picture of it at the time because I was tempted to just drive through and say, oh, these are a bunch of crazy people. It's not just a bunch of crazy people. It's part of a pattern. Everything we took for granted, that trying to live even according to the Big Ten, if we just thought living according to the Big Ten, who could even argue with that? Even that's attacked. Even that's attacked. You're definitely going to be in a minority, probably in a big city today, if you were to put one of those 10 Commandment signs in your yard. It would be fine if you put a political sign in your yard that mirrored the political leanings of that particular neighborhood, but God forbid you should put up a 10 Commandment sign. God forbid we should have the 10 Commandments hanging up in our judicial system. God forbid that we would swear our legislators in with their hands on a holy Bible instead of the document of their choice. You see how little by little? It's not it's not your imagination. I'm here to tell you that it is not your imagination. These are footsteps of Messiah. Are they the last footsteps? I don't know. But I know for our generation, these are our footsteps of Messiah. And if we're not spiritually woke in the Holy Spirit to know it's time to withdraw from some things, say, oh, we want to influence for good. We want to influence for good. We do. And there's a time for that. But there is a time for everything under the sun. And there's just going to have to be some things that we're willing to let go of. And we're going to have to depend on the Father to provide for us. But the pattern, the rabbi says, you'll start to depend also upon one another to form these little communities. And I think this is very consistent with what we've been seeing in these classes over the last few years, that people are less independently minded about just wanting to wrestle over the scriptures, and instead they're willing to set some things aside for the sake of a community. We see that in Jacob's tent. We see that at River of Life. We see that, with other Messianic communities I may not personally be aware of, but people, they say, you know what, I don't need that job and that money so bad that I am isolated from people of faith who believe and who live the way that I live. And I'm not saying that to discourage those of you who are isolated where you are. It's okay. It's okay. Just don't forget to listen. He will take you those steps into the wilderness. And it may be that your wilderness will be right where you are. If it's a withdrawal from those systems, it might be right where you are, but it might also mean that you physically move somewhere. And like Yeshua said, we're going to do Matthew 24 next week. as it pertains to this, because Yeshua was very specific in talking about this event. And he said, look, don't stop and try to take something out of the house. Don't let your hands cling to things. When it's time to go, when you hear the call, don't even worry about the clothes. Those aren't the clothes you're going to be needing. Right? Don't worry about taking a bag. Don't pack. Go. He'll give you your clothes. He'll give you your food. He'll give you your water, and he'll give you clouds of glory. But you're going to have to give him all your trust. You're going to have to give him any ounce shred of pride, because it will humble you. There's nothing to feel proud about when you're being chased around the wilderness. When you're being chased through the Red Sea, it doesn't feel good to be chased. Just understand, you have to be like Abraham, see what you can't see. Understand who's holding the stick, understand who's surrounding you in the clouds, understand who's the protection beneath your feet, the clouds over your head, who's determining your direction. And if you're like Yeshua, if you just say, you know what, I quit all God competition. There is nothing of him that I can replace, that I can do better, that I am equal to. So don't be afraid. He's got to clean out the world systems. He's not going to build on top of theirs. He's going to clean it off. And we're about to find out how much we're hoping they aren't. If you're human, you're thinking, yeah, I want all that to happen. But there's also a part of you that says, now, wait a minute, this is all I've ever known. I don't know how comfortable I am with him destroying every system. But the rabbis say, until there is not a pruta, which is like a penny, until there's not a penny left in a purse, will Messiah come. He will destroy this whole commercial system, because he's going to build a new one in righteousness and true justice, justice of every kind. And that's
this reminds me of the Torah portion where Rivka, she leaves the city to go and marry a man